The year was 1893, Chicago, a city still scarred by the memory of fire, still rebuilding itself from ashes that had consumed everything just 2 decades before. And yet, in the span of mere months, something impossible rose from the shores of Lake Michigan, something that defied explanation. Something that, to this day, remains one of the greatest architectural enigmas in American history. They called it the White City. The world's Columbian Exposition sprawled across nearly 700 acres of what had been swampland and debris. More than 200 buildings emerged from the mud, their facades gleaming with classical columns, enormous domes, and intricate sculptures that seemed to belong to ancient Rome or Renaissance Florence rather than the industrial Midwest. The centerpiece, the administration building, stood with a dome larger than the Capitol itself. The Palace of Fine Arts stretched across acres of perfectly manicured grounds. The Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building enclosed 44 acres under a single roof, the largest indoor space ever constructed at that time. The official narrative tells us that these structures were built in approximately 2 years. 2 years to transform marshland into a neoclassical paradise. 2 years to erect buildings that architects today admit would require decades of planning and construction with modern equipment. 2 years to create what visitors described as the most beautiful city ever built by human hands. And then, almost as quickly as it appeared, the White City vanished. Within months of the exposition's closing, nearly every structure was demolished. The marble facades crumbled. The grand halls collapsed into rubble. The canals were filled with dirt. The gardens were plowed under. By 1894, almost nothing remained of what millions had called the greatest architectural achievement in human history. Only the Palace of Fine Arts survived, and even that building has been rebuilt twice since, its original materials long since replaced. The questions begin here, in the silence that followed the demolition. Why would a nation that had just created the most spectacular urban environment in the modern world choose to destroy it so completely? Why would structures built with such apparent permanence be treated as temporary? And how, precisely, did a city ravaged by fire manage to conjure a classical wonderland in less time than it takes to construct a modern shopping mall? The answers, it seems, were never meant to be found. Consider the photographs that survive from that era. Study them carefully, as countless researchers have done in the decades since. Notice the scale of the buildings compared to the human figures walking beneath their columns. Notice the precision of the stonework, the geometric perfection of the arches, the impossible symmetry of structures that allegedly emerged from raw construction sites in a matter of months. Notice, too, the curious absence of construction photographs. For an event of such historical magnitude, documented by hundreds of photographers, there exists remarkably little visual evidence of the actual building process. What photographs do exist show something strange. Workers are often seen cleaning buildings rather than constructing them. Crews appear to be excavating rather than laying foundations. In several images, the grand structures stand complete while workers labor in foreground trenches, as though unearthing something that was already there rather than creating something new. This detail haunted the early researchers who began questioning the official narrative. If the White City was truly built from scratch, where are the images of scaffolding rising against half-finished domes? Where are the photographs of marble blocks being lifted into place? Where's the visual documentation of the most ambitious construction project in American history? The silence in the archives speaks louder than any record, but Chicago was not alone. Throughout the 19th century, American cities experienced what historians call a period of unprecedented architectural achievement. San Francisco, Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and dozens of smaller cities suddenly bristled with grand civic buildings, ornate train stations, and elaborate public spaces that bore an uncanny resemblance to one another and to architectural traditions far older than the Republic itself. The state capitol buildings erected across the nation during this period share a remarkable similarity of design, materials, and execution. Their domes echo classical proportions. Their columns follow ancient formulas. Their interior spaces exhibit acoustic properties that modern architects struggle to replicate. And their construction timelines, documented in official records, suggest building speeds that contemporary engineers find difficult to explain. In Sacramento, the California state capitol rose between 1861 and 1874. Its dome and classical facade bearing striking resemblance to buildings across Europe and Asia that supposedly share no architectural lineage with American democracy. In Austin, the Texas state capitol was allegedly constructed in just 7 years, its granite walls and towering dome rivaling the United States Capitol itself. In Albany, the New York State Capitol consumed 32 years and $25 million. Yet even this extended timeline has been questioned by researchers who note discrepancies between official records and surviving photographs. The pattern repeats across the continent. Grand buildings appear in cities that, according to census records, barely had populations sufficient to support such construction. Ornate train stations emerge in frontier towns that supposedly were still fighting for basic survival against wilderness and weather. Libraries, courthouses, and municipal buildings of extraordinary sophistication materialize in communities that officially had existed for mere decades. And beneath many of these structures, something else waits, something that modern renovation projects have repeatedly uncovered. Often to the confusion of contractors and the silence of official institutions. In St. Paul, Minnesota, workers excavating beneath the Landmark Center discovered a network of tunnels extending far beyond the building's official footprint. The tunnels were constructed with the same materials and craftsmanship as the structure above, yet no records explain their purpose or their presence. Similar discoveries have occurred beneath city halls, post offices, and public buildings throughout the country. In some cases, the underground spaces exceed the square footage of the buildings they support. These subterranean networks have been explained away as coal storage, utility passages, or simply forgotten basements. But the explanations often fail to account for the scale of construction, the quality of materials, or the geometric precision of tunnels that seem designed for purposes far beyond storage. Some researchers have suggested that these underground spaces represent not additions to existing buildings, but remnants of structures that predated them, structures that the visible buildings were constructed to conceal or replace. The hypothesis sounds extreme. It requires accepting that something existed before the accepted history of these locations. Something sophisticated enough to build with precision, but obscure enough to leave no written record. It requires believing that the founding narratives of American cities might be incomplete, edited, or deliberately misleading, and yet the physical evidence continues to accumulate. In Detroit, the old Michigan Central Station stood abandoned for decades, its grand waiting hall and towering facade crumbling in plain sight. When researchers documented the building's deterioration, they noted construction techniques that seemed inconsistent with its official 1913 completion date. The acoustics of the main hall, the precision of the stonework, the materials used in hidden structural elements, all suggested methods and knowledge that the early 20th century had supposedly not yet developed. Similar anomalies appear in the grand terminals of New York, in the historic districts of Philadelphia, in the Victorian mansions of San Francisco that survived the 1906 earthquake, while newer buildings collapsed around them. The pattern suggests not merely impressive craftsmanship, but a systematic approach to construction that somehow became lost in the very period when industrial progress should have preserved and enhanced it. The mystery deepens when examining what happened to the knowledge itself. American architecture of the late 19th century achieved heights that the 20th century largely abandoned. The grand civic buildings gave way to utilitarian boxes. The ornate train stations were demolished or converted. The craft traditions that produced buildings of such beauty and durability simply ceased to be practiced, replaced by techniques that prioritize speed and cost over permanence and aesthetics. This transition has been explained as the natural evolution of industrial society, the triumph of efficiency over elegance. But some researchers see a different pattern. They see not evolution but erasure, not progress but forgetting. Not the natural replacement of old methods by new, but the deliberate suppression of knowledge that should have been preserved. The White City of Chicago, they suggest, was not a triumph of modern construction, but a revelation of something much older. Its rapid appearance was possible because the knowledge and infrastructure already existed. Its rapid destruction was necessary because what it revealed was never meant to be seen by the public that marveled at its beauty. This is where the investigation begins. Not with answers, but with questions. Not with certainty, but with the uncomfortable awareness that the physical evidence does not match the official story. The silence beneath the marble has something to tell us. The empty spaces in the archives speak of absences that were not accidental. The buildings that remain and the buildings that were destroyed form a pattern that demands examination. In the chapters that follow, we will trace this pattern across the American landscape. We will examine the photographs that contradict the timelines. We will explore the underground spaces that no one can explain. We will listen to the testimonies of those who saw things that did not fit the narrative they were given. And we will ask the question that has haunted researchers for generations. What if the civilization that built these wonders was not our own? What if the American landscape bears the traces of an empire that history has tried to forget? What if the lost world of Tartaria left its fingerprints not in distant lands but in the very cities where we live and work and walk? Unseeing past monuments to a past that was stolen from our memory. The investigation has begun. The evidence awaits. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Every week we uncover pieces of forgotten history that mainstream narratives have buried. If you believe that truth matters more than convenience, this is where you belong. San Francisco, 1906. The earthquake struck at 5:12 in the morning on April 18th, followed by fires that burned for 3 days and consumed nearly 500 city blocks. When the smoke cleared, the world saw images of devastation that had defined disaster photography ever since. Collapsed buildings, twisted metal, rubble-choked streets stretching to the horizon. But among the thousands of photographs taken in the aftermath, some images tell a different story. A story that challenges everything we have been taught about what San Francisco was before the destruction. Consider the photographs taken from Nob Hill, looking down across the ruined cityscape toward the waterfront. In the foreground, the mansions of the wealthy lie in ruins, their ornate facades crumbled into their foundations. But in the distance, beyond the smoke and debris, something stands intact. Massive structures of classical design, their domes and columns visible through the haze, apparently untouched by the catastrophe that leveled everything around them. The official explanation identifies these surviving structures as buildings of superior construction, built to withstand seismic activity by architects who understood earthquake-resistant design decades before such knowledge was supposedly formalized. But the explanation raises more questions than it answers. How did 19th century builders, working without modern seismic science, construct buildings that survived a magnitude 7.9 earthquake when surrounding structures of similar vintage collapsed? What knowledge did they possess that was subsequently lost? The photographs suggest an answer that official history cannot accept. The buildings that survived were not built by the same hands that constructed the buildings that fell. They were older, built with different methods, designed for different purposes. They belonged to a different San Francisco, a city that existed before the city that history remembers. Similar anomalies appear in photographs from cities across the nation. In New York, images from the late 19th century show downtown Manhattan bristling with grand buildings that seem to appear almost overnight. One photograph from the 1880s shows a particular city block still dotted with modest wooden structures. Another photograph from just 5 years later shows the same block dominated by an enormous stone building of classical design, its construction timeline impossibly compressed. The speed of construction documented in these photographs has never been adequately explained. Modern skyscrapers built with steel frames and powered equipment require years of planning and construction. Yet the grand buildings of 19th century America, built supposedly with hand tools and horse-drawn carts, appeared in timelines that would challenge contemporary construction crews with access to technology their predecessors could not have imagined. In Boston, the photographs tell a similar story. The Back Bay neighborhood, built on landfill reclaimed from tidal flats, features block after block of brownstone townhouses that appeared in the decades following the Civil War. The official narrative describes a methodical process of land reclamation and construction, but the photographs show something different. They show buildings emerging from the mud too quickly, too uniformly, too perfectly to match the primitive construction methods supposedly employed. The Back Bay buildings share more than a construction mystery. They share architectural features with buildings thousands of miles away, features that suggest not independent design but a common source. The proportions of windows to walls, the ratios of facade to depth, the geometric relationships between structural elements, all follow patterns that repeat across cities that supposedly had no communication or coordination. This uniformity has been explained as the influence of popular architectural styles, the spread of pattern books and professional standards through an increasingly connected nation. The explanation fails to account for the precision of the repetition. Buildings designed independently by different architects for different clients in different cities should show variation, the natural diversity of human creativity working within shared traditions. Instead, they show conformity that suggests not influence but instruction, not style but specification. The photographs that document this conformity have become a focus of research for those who question the official narrative. They show buildings in Minneapolis that mirror buildings in Memphis. They show courthouses in Ohio that could be twins of courthouses in Oregon. They show train stations and post offices and public libraries that share not merely general design principles but specific dimensions, specific ornamental details, specific engineering solutions. The pattern extends beyond individual buildings to entire urban layouts. The grid plans of American cities, supposedly designed by surveyors and planners working independently, exhibit geometric relationships that suggest centralized planning or inherited knowledge. The placement of public buildings, the width of major boulevards, the angles of diagonal avenues, all follow patterns that repeat too consistently to be coincidental. In Washington, D.C., the grid plan designed by Pierre Charles L'Enfant has been celebrated as a masterpiece of urban planning, a deliberate recreation of European capitals adapted for the democratic experiment. But researchers have noted that L'Enfant's plan shares features with cities built long before his time and far from any European influence. The astronomical alignments of major avenues, the geometric relationships between monuments, the proportional spacing of public spaces, all suggest knowledge that no 18th century planner should have possessed. The photographs that survive from Washington's early years show something even more puzzling. They show grand buildings standing in relative isolation, surrounded by modest structures and undeveloped land. The Capitol, the White House, the early government buildings, all appear in photographs as though they were placed in a landscape rather than grown from it. Their scale and sophistication seem disconnected from the modest city that surrounded them, as though they belonged to a different civilization entirely. This discontinuity between grand structures and humble surroundings appears in photographs from cities across the nation. The contrast has been explained as evidence of ambition outpacing development, of cities building monuments to futures they had not yet achieved. But the explanation assumes that modest communities could somehow finance and construct buildings that rivaled European capitals, could somehow acquire the knowledge and materials and skilled labor to create architectural wonders in wilderness settings. The alternative explanation requires accepting something that contradicts everything we have been taught. It requires believing that the grand buildings were not built by the communities that surrounded them, that they predated the cities that grew up around them, that they were inherited rather than constructed. This hypothesis, once considered the province of fringe speculation, has gained traction as researchers have examined the physical evidence more carefully. The materials used in many historic buildings include stones and metals that local quarries and foundries could not have produced. The construction techniques visible in surviving structures suggest tools and methods that were not available to builders of the supposed construction era. The acoustic and thermal properties of certain buildings indicate engineering knowledge that the official timeline cannot explain. The photographs document all of this if one knows how to read them. They show buildings with foundation depths that exceed official records. They show construction sites where workers appear to be cleaning rather than building. They show completed structures in periods when official histories claim they were still under construction. They show, in other words, a history that does not match the story we have been told. The question becomes not whether the photographs lie, but whether our interpretation of them has been guided by assumptions that prevent us from seeing what they actually show. When we look at an image of a grand building rising from a modest city, we assume construction. But what if we are seeing excavation? What if we are seeing rediscovery? What if we are seeing the emergence of something that was buried rather than the creation of something new? The photographs that should not exist, that document construction timelines too compressed to be possible, that show buildings too sophisticated for their supposed era, that reveal patterns too consistent to be coincidental, all point toward the same conclusion. The architecture of America was not entirely built by Americans. Something else was here first. Something that left monuments across the landscape, something that was either destroyed or buried, its memory erased along with its presence. The photographs preserve what words have forgotten. They wait in archives and collections, in museums and private hands, for those who are willing to look past the captions and see what the images actually show. And what they show changes everything. Beneath the streets of Seattle, another city waits in darkness. The Seattle Underground is one of America's strangest tourist attractions. A network of subterranean passages and buried storefronts that visitors can explore beneath the modern city. The official story explains these spaces as remnants of the original downtown, buried when the city razed its streets after a devastating fire in 1889. According to this narrative, Seattle simply built over itself, leaving the old street level entombed beneath new construction. But visitors who descend into the underground often notice details that the official story does not explain. The passages are too wide, the ceilings too high, the construction too sophisticated for a frontier town that, in 1889, was barely 40 years old. The stonework shows precision that would challenge modern masons. The architectural details suggest planning and resources that a small Pacific Northwest city should not have possessed. Similar underground spaces exist beneath cities across America, and in every case, the official explanations strain credibility. In Portland, Oregon, the Shanghai tunnels allegedly served as passages for criminal enterprises, secret routes for kidnapping sailors and transporting contraband. The tunnels are extensive, well-constructed, and far too elaborate for their supposed illicit purposes. In Los Angeles, tunnel networks beneath downtown have been explained as Prohibition-era speakeasies and utility passages. But their extent and construction quality suggest purposes far more significant than hiding alcohol or routing pipes. The pattern repeats in Indianapolis and Kansas City and St. Louis and dozens of cities that share no apparent connection except the presence of underground spaces that no one can adequately explain. The tunnels vary in size and complexity, but they share common features: solid construction, geometric precision, connections to major public buildings, and origin stories that do not match their physical characteristics. Chicago. The underground network is particularly extensive. Beneath the loop, miles of tunnels connect buildings and stretch toward the lakefront. The official explanation describes them as utility passages for coal delivery and freight transport. But the tunnels include features that have nothing to do with industrial utility. There are rooms with acoustic properties that suggest other purposes. There are passages that dead-end at walls that show signs of having once continued further. There are spaces whose dimensions and construction match the grandest buildings above ground. These underground spaces have generally been dismissed as curiosities, remnants of industrial-era infrastructure that modern cities have simply forgotten. But researchers who have mapped and documented them note patterns that suggest something more significant. The tunnels align with astronomical features. Their layouts follow geometric principles that appear in architectural traditions far older than American cities. Their construction materials include stones and metals that local sources could not have provided. The hypothesis that emerges from this evidence challenges our understanding of American history at its foundation. It suggests that the underground networks are not remnants of early American construction, but survivors of something that came before. It proposes that the cities built above these tunnels were constructed to conceal and replace what had been there, to occupy space that was already significant for reasons that official history does not acknowledge. If you have watched this far and felt something stir in your recognition, something that whispers of truths buried beneath the surface of the world you know, leave a comment saying, "I feel the silence beneath the stones." Let your words join the voices of those who are beginning to remember. The evidence for pre-American construction extends beyond tunnels to include structural anomalies in buildings themselves. Across the nation, historic preservation projects have uncovered features that do not match official construction timelines, foundations that extend deeper than plans indicate, materials that were not available in the supposed construction era, construction techniques that were not developed until decades after buildings were allegedly completed. In New York City, renovation of historic buildings has repeatedly revealed these anomalies. The old post office, demolished to make way for Penn Station, which was itself later demolished, had foundation walls that extended far below street level, deeper than any 19th century construction project should have required. The original Madison Square Garden, long since replaced, sat atop structural elements that engineers could not explain within the context of its supposed 1879 construction. The Woolworth Building, completed in 1913 and celebrated as the world's tallest building for nearly 2 decades, rests on foundations that reach to bedrock in ways that challenge the official construction narrative. Workers who participated in the building's construction reportedly spoke of excavating existing structures rather than laying new foundations, of uncovering spaces and passages that no one had expected to find. These testimonies have been dismissed as confusion or exaggeration, the natural distortion of memory over time. But they align too closely with physical evidence to be easily explained away. The buildings themselves, their foundations and basements and structural cores, preserve evidence that words can deny but stone cannot hide. The mystery deepens when considering what filled these underground spaces before they were sealed or repurposed. Reports from 19th century construction projects describe discoveries that were never officially documented. Workers reported finding artifacts, remnants of earlier occupation, evidence of previous habitation that predated any accepted timeline for human presence in North America. These discoveries were either destroyed, hidden, or attributed to unknown earlier settlers whose existence was never incorporated into official history. The suppression of evidence is itself evidence. The systematic dismissal of anomalous findings. The consistent failure to investigate discoveries that contradict accepted narratives. The pattern of destruction that eliminated artifacts before they could be studied, all suggest a deliberate effort to maintain a particular version of history. The question is not whether such suppression occurred, but why. What would be threatened by acknowledging that sophisticated construction predated American settlement? What narratives would collapse if the underground empire were recognized for what it might represent? The answers to these questions remain hidden, buried as deeply as the tunnels themselves. But the physical evidence continues to surface. Every renovation project, every foundation excavation, every infrastructure upgrade risks uncovering something that was meant to stay forgotten. And each discovery adds another data point to a pattern that becomes harder to dismiss with each passing year. The underground empire waits beneath our feet. Its passages connect buildings and neighborhoods that appear unrelated on the surface. Its rooms preserve acoustic and geometric properties that modern builders cannot replicate. Its very existence challenges everything we think we know about who was here before us and what they left behind. To descend into these spaces is to enter another world, a world of silence and stone, of shadows that remember what sunlight has forgotten. The tourists who visit the Seattle Underground, the curious who explore the tunnels beneath Kansas City, the researchers who map the hidden passages beneath Chicago, all sense something that the official narratives cannot explain. They sense the presence of the past. Not the recent past of Victorian merchants and pioneer settlers, but something older, something more significant, something that shaped the landscape in ways we are only beginning to understand. The stones remember, the tunnels preserve. The underground empire endures, waiting for those who are ready to see it, waiting for the moment when the surface story can no longer contain the truth that lies beneath. The old post offices of America share a secret. They stand in cities large and small, from the great metropolitan centers to modest county seats. And despite their geographic dispersion, they exhibit similarities that cannot be explained by coincidence or fashion. Their proportions follow mathematical relationships that appear in sacred architecture across civilizations. Their interior spaces create acoustic environments that seem designed for purposes beyond sorting mail. Their construction quality exceeds what their budgets and timelines should have permitted. The Treasury Department, which oversaw the construction of federal buildings in the 19th century, maintained detailed records of costs, materials, and construction schedules. These records tell a story of remarkable efficiency, of buildings completed on time and within budget, of architectural achievements that rivaled private commissions by the nation's wealthiest citizens. But the records also contain anomalies that researchers have noted with increasing frequency, construction schedules that appear impossibly compressed, material costs that do not align with market prices of the supposed construction era, labor records that list fewer workers than the projects should have required. The discrepancies are subtle enough to escape casual notice, but significant enough to challenge the official narrative when examined systematically. The post offices are merely the most visible examples of a broader pattern. Federal courthouses, customs houses, and government offices from the same era share the same anomalies. They were built too quickly, too cheaply, too well to match the resources and capabilities that 19th century government agencies supposedly possessed. Consider the old post office in St. Louis, completed in 1884 and expanded in subsequent years. Its granite walls rise 4 stories, topped by an elaborate copper roof and crowned with a clock tower that remains one of the city's most distinctive landmarks. The building's interior features marble floors, ornate metalwork, and a central atrium that extends to skylights far above. The construction quality is extraordinary, the craftsmanship evident in every detail. The official records indicate that this building was constructed in approximately 3 years. 3 years to quarry, transport, and install massive granite blocks. 3 years to fabricate and position thousands of copper and iron elements. 3 years to create an interior of such complexity that modern restoration projects require years merely to maintain it. The timeline strains credibility. Modern construction projects of comparable scope require decades. The Empire State Building, often cited as an example of exceptional construction speed, required over 4 years from groundbreaking to completion, and it used steel frame construction rather than the massive masonry of the old post office. The comparison suggests that either 19th century builders possessed capabilities that we have lost, or the official timelines do not tell the complete story. Similar calculations apply to grand buildings across the nation. The state capitals, the railroad terminals, the university buildings, the public libraries, all exhibit construction timelines that challenge contemporary understanding. The experts who have examined these timelines offer various explanations: larger labor forces, simpler permitting processes, less stringent safety requirements. But the explanations fail to account for the precision and quality of the finished buildings. Speed and quality do not naturally coincide, yet the architecture of this era achieved both simultaneously. The mathematical relationships embedded in these buildings add another layer of mystery. Researchers who have measured the proportions of columns, the dimensions of spaces, the angles of roof lines have discovered recurring ratios that appear in architectural traditions around the world. The golden ratio, the musical proportions of classical design, the geometric relationships found in ancient temples and medieval cathedrals, all appear in American buildings that were supposedly designed by practical professionals with no esoteric knowledge. These mathematical relationships have acoustic and energetic implications. Spaces designed according to these proportions create specific resonance patterns, amplify and direct sound in predictable ways, and affect the experience of those who occupy them. The great halls and chambers of 19th century America were not merely aesthetically pleasing. They were functionally sophisticated in ways that their official designers could not have fully understood. Modern architects and engineers have struggled to replicate these acoustic properties. Concert halls built in the 20th century, despite access to advanced acoustic science, rarely achieved the natural resonance of older buildings constructed according to traditional proportions. The knowledge that produced these spaces was not documented in the textbooks of the supposed construction era. It came from somewhere else. The source of this knowledge is the central mystery. If the architects and builders of 19th century America possessed understanding that has since been lost, where did they acquire it? If they were merely following inherited traditions, whose traditions were they? If they were rediscovering ancient knowledge, how did they know where to look? The buildings themselves preserve clues. In their foundations and hidden spaces, in their structural cores and sealed chambers, evidence awaits that could answer these questions. But access to this evidence has been restricted, obscured, or simply ignored by institutions responsible for maintaining official narratives. Renovation projects that have penetrated beneath surface appearances have made discoveries that challenge accepted history. Workers have found materials that should not exist in buildings of the supposed construction era. Engineers have documented construction techniques that were not developed until decades later. Archaeologists have uncovered artifacts that predate any accepted timeline for the sites in question. These discoveries have been handled with remarkable consistency. They are noted in internal documents, discussed among professionals, and then quietly buried. The buildings are restored to their official appearances, the anomalies covered over. The evidence preserved only in private collections and obscure archives. The architecture of impossibility stands in plain sight, hiding secrets in its very visibility. We walk past these buildings daily, accepting their presence as natural consequences of American ambition and energy. We do not ask how they were built because we assume we already know the answer. We do not question their origins because questioning would require abandoning assumptions that frame our entire understanding of history. But the buildings ask questions whether we are ready to hear them or not. Their proportions encode knowledge that someone understood. Their acoustics demonstrate capabilities that someone possessed. Their construction quality proves that someone had resources and skills that the official record does not acknowledge. The architecture of impossibility is the architecture of amnesia. We have forgotten what we should remember. We have accepted stories that do not match the stone. We have allowed convenience to overwrite truth. The buildings wait for us to remember. Their walls hold testimony that has outlasted the voices of their builders. Their spaces preserve resonance that carries meaning beyond sound. Their very existence challenges us to look more carefully, to question more deeply, to acknowledge the possibility that what we see is not what we have been told. And when we are finally ready to listen, they will tell us everything. Something happened at the turn of the 20th century that historians have never adequately explained. The architectural traditions that had produced America's grandest buildings suddenly ceased. The craftsmen who had created ornate stonework and intricate metalwork seemed to vanish overnight. The knowledge that had enabled construction of seemingly impossible structures simply stopped being transmitted. This transition has been described as modernization, as the natural evolution of building practices in response to changing economic conditions and aesthetic preferences. The explanation sounds reasonable until one examines what was actually lost. The skills required to carve stone ornamentation, to forge decorative metalwork, to design spaces according to acoustic principles, all disappeared within a single generation. These were not marginal techniques, but fundamental knowledge that had been practiced for centuries. Their sudden abandonment suggests something more significant than changing fashion. The early 20th century also saw the systematic demolition of buildings that had stood for decades. Train stations, post offices, civic buildings, and private mansions were torn down at unprecedented rates, replaced by structures of lesser quality and shorter lifespan. The demolitions were justified by claims of progress, by the need for modern facilities, by the economic inefficiency of maintaining old buildings. But the pattern of destruction was too thorough, too coordinated, too complete to be explained by simple economics. Penn Station in New York, demolished in 1963, had stood as one of the greatest public spaces in America. Its grand waiting hall, modeled on Roman baths, could accommodate thousands under vaulted ceilings that rose higher than the nave of St. Peter's Basilica. The building was only 50 years old when it was destroyed, replaced by a cramped underground facility that architectural critics immediately condemned as one of the worst public spaces in the nation. The demolition of Penn Station sparked the historic preservation movement in America, but by then countless similar buildings had already been lost. The original Grand Central Depot, the old Chicago Post Office, the first Madison Square Garden, municipal buildings and train stations and public halls across the country, all were demolished in a wave of destruction that erased much of the architectural heritage of the 19th century. The official explanation emphasizes economics. Older buildings cost more to maintain than to replace, and the land they occupied had become too valuable for structures that did not maximize its potential. But the explanation ignores the fact that many demolished buildings occupied land that remained undeveloped for years after their destruction. It ignores the cultural and aesthetic value that cannot be measured in economic terms. And it ignores the pattern, the systematic nature of the destruction, which suggests motives beyond simple profit. What if the demolitions were not random acts of modernization, but deliberate erasure? What if the buildings that were destroyed contained evidence that was never meant to survive? What if the Great Forgetting was not accidental, but engineered? The timing of this architectural amnesia coincides with other significant erasures. The early 20th century saw the standardization of historical narratives, the professionalization of archaeology and historical research, and the consolidation of institutional control over how the past was interpreted and taught. Alternative theories about human history, about the origins of civilization, about the builders of ancient monuments were marginalized or suppressed. The acceptable boundaries of historical inquiry narrowed dramatically, leaving little room for questions that challenged official narratives. This intellectual consolidation affected how Americans understood their own built environment. The grand buildings that remained were reinterpreted within acceptable frameworks. Their construction was attributed to known architects working with documented methods. Their similarities were explained by reference to shared styles and professional standards. Their anomalies were either ignored or rationalized within existing paradigms. The educational system reinforced these interpretations. Students learned to see American architecture as an extension of European traditions, transplanted to the New World by educated professionals who applied classical knowledge to new conditions. They did not learn to question construction timelines. They did not examine materials or methods too closely. They did not ask who built what they saw or how such building was possible. The forgetting was comprehensive and effective. Within generations, the questions that earlier observers had asked were no longer being posed. The anomalies that researchers had documented were no longer being investigated. The possibilities that once seemed worth considering were no longer being discussed. But forgetting is not the same as erasure. The buildings that survive preserve evidence that stories cannot eliminate. The photographs and documents that remain in archives contain information that official narratives cannot completely suppress. The underground spaces that wait beneath our cities hold secrets that no amount of surface construction can permanently conceal. The Great Forgetting was an attempt to control what Americans know about their own landscape. It was an effort to establish a particular version of history as the only legitimate version. It was a project of limitation, defining what questions could be asked and what answers would be accepted. But the attempt was never complete. Questions persisted in the minds of those who looked too closely. Doubts survived in the observations of those who noticed anomalies. Alternative possibilities continued to circulate among researchers who refused to accept official explanations at face value. The recovery of memory is now underway. The tools of modern research, digital photography and online archives and crowdsourced investigation have made it possible to examine evidence that was previously accessible only to specialists. The communities of inquiry that have formed around these questions have grown from isolated eccentrics to substantial movements with serious researchers and genuine expertise. The Great Forgetting failed because it attempted the impossible. It tried to eliminate knowledge that was encoded in physical reality. It tried to suppress questions that physical evidence continued to raise. It tried to maintain a story that the stone itself contradicted. The recovery will not be quick or easy. Institutions that have built their authority on official narratives have no incentive to acknowledge alternatives. Professional reputations depend on defending established interpretations. Academic careers are built on reinforcing accepted frameworks rather than challenging them. But truth has a weight that lies cannot indefinitely bear. The evidence accumulates. The questions multiply. The researchers persist. And eventually the story that the buildings tell will become impossible to ignore. The great forgetting is ending. The great remembering has begun. Stand in the rotunda of a surviving state capitol building. Close your eyes. Listen to the silence, to the space itself, to the quality of air and sound that such architecture creates. Notice how your breath changes, how your heartbeat seems to synchronize with the rhythm of the space. Notice how thoughts become clearer, how awareness expands, how the ordinary concerns of daily life seem to recede into insignificance. This experience is not accidental. The builders of these spaces understood something that modern architecture has forgotten. They knew that physical space affects consciousness. They designed their buildings not merely to house functions but to transform those who entered them. They created environments that elevated human experience, that connected individuals to something larger than themselves, that served purposes beyond the practical and visible. The resonance of what remains is more than metaphor. Sound behaves differently in these buildings than in modern structures. Voices carry further with greater clarity. Music fills spaces with a richness that recording studios struggle to replicate. The acoustic properties that these buildings exhibit were not developed by accident or intuition alone. They required knowledge of mathematical relationships, of material properties, of human perception that was somehow available to their builders. Modern acoustic science can describe what these buildings do but cannot fully explain how their builders knew to do it. The proportions that create optimal resonance, the materials that enhance certain frequencies, the shapes that direct sound without distortion, all appear in buildings constructed before the scientific principles were formally articulated. The knowledge was practical before it was theoretical. It was applied before it was understood. This reversal of the expected order suggests that the builders inherited knowledge rather than discovering it. They worked from traditions that encoded understanding accumulated over generations, perhaps centuries, perhaps longer. They knew what worked without necessarily knowing why it worked. They built according to principles that had been validated by experience rather than derived from theory. The question of where this knowledge originated returns us to the central mystery. If American builders of the 19th century possessed understanding that exceeded their supposed capabilities, they must have received it from somewhere. The obvious answer is European tradition, the accumulated knowledge of classical and Renaissance architecture transmitted across the Atlantic. But European architecture of the same period, while impressive, does not fully explain the anomalies of American construction. The scale, the speed, the uniformity across vast distances all suggest something more than transplanted tradition. The alternative hypothesis proposes that the knowledge was already here, not brought by European settlers, but waiting for them, encoded in structures that predated their arrival, preserved in buildings that they did not construct but inherited. This hypothesis requires accepting that sophisticated civilization existed in North America before the accepted timeline of European colonization. That evidence of this civilization was systematically suppressed, and that the grand buildings of American cities represent not original construction but renovation, restoration, or concealment of what was already present. The evidence for this hypothesis is circumstantial but cumulative. The construction timelines that defy explanation, the materials that could not have been locally sourced, the techniques that were not developed until later, the underground spaces that no one planned, the photographs that show cleaning rather than building, the testimonies that describe discovery rather than creation. Each piece of evidence considered alone can be explained away. Considered together, they form a pattern that alternative theories struggle to dismiss. The resonance of what remains carries this pattern forward. The buildings that survived the wave of demolition preserve evidence in their very existence. Their walls contain materials that can be tested. Their foundations reach to depths that can be measured. Their acoustic properties demonstrate capabilities that can be documented. The physical reality of these structures constrains what stories can be told about them. The investigation of this evidence is ongoing. Researchers with backgrounds in architecture, engineering, acoustics, and history have begun examining American buildings with new questions and new methods. They photograph details that previous investigators overlooked. They measure dimensions that official records do not include. They test materials that no one thought to analyze. Their findings accumulate in archives and databases that grow more comprehensive each year. The conclusion toward which this evidence points remains controversial. The institutions that guard official narratives have not embraced alternative interpretations. The professionals whose careers depend on established frameworks have not welcomed challenges to their expertise. The public that has been educated within these narratives has not readily abandoned familiar understandings, but the resonance persists. The buildings continue to speak to those who are willing to listen. The questions continue to multiply for those who are willing to ask. The evidence continues to accumulate for those who are willing to look. The lost empire of Tartaria may never be definitively proven or disproven. The suppression of evidence, the destruction of buildings, the erasure of records may have been too thorough to allow complete recovery of what was lost. But the attempt to forget was never fully successful. Something remains, something resonates, something waits to be remembered, and perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the purpose of this investigation is not to prove a specific alternative history, but to open the possibility that history itself is more complex, more mysterious, more wonderful than we have been taught. Perhaps the value of questioning is not the answers it produces, but the awareness it cultivates. The recognition that official stories are always partial, always interested, always subject to revision in light of evidence that does not fit. The civilization that built these structures, whatever we choose to call it, whatever timeline we assign to its existence, understood something essential about the relationship between architecture and consciousness. It knew how to build spaces that elevated human experience. It possessed knowledge that made such building possible, and it left behind monuments that preserve that knowledge for those who are ready to receive it. Stand in the resonance of what remains. Feel the quality of the space. Listen to the silence that is not empty but full, charged with meaning that transcends words. This is the inheritance that survives. This is the evidence that persists. This is the memory that returns, unbidden but undeniable, to those who are willing to remember. The lost empire was never completely lost. It lives in the buildings that remain. It speaks in the acoustic spaces that preserve its knowledge. It waits in the underground passages that no one can explain. It resonates in the mathematical relationships that structure our most beautiful architecture. To recognize this is to begin the recovery of what was stolen. To acknowledge the mystery is to open the door to remembrance. To question the official stories is to participate in the great project of reconstruction that this moment in history demands. The investigation is not complete. The evidence continues to surface. The questions continue to multiply, and the resonance of what remains continues to call across generations and centuries to those who are ready to hear. If you have watched this far, it is because you have felt something that words cannot fully capture. You have sensed the presence of a history larger than the one you were taught. You have recognized, perhaps for the first time, that the world around you contains mysteries that deserve exploration. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far," so I can get to know you and know who really likes the stories on this channel. Your engagement tells me that this work matters, that these questions deserve to be asked, that the search for truth has value regardless of where it leads. If this investigation has opened new perspectives for you, please like this video and share it with others who might be ready to question what they have been taught. The recovery of memory is a collective project. It requires communities of inquiry, networks of researchers, audiences willing to support work that challenges established narratives. And if you haven't already subscribed, do so now. Every week we explore the mysteries that mainstream history has overlooked. We examine the evidence that official narratives cannot explain. We ask the questions that institutions prefer to avoid. This channel is dedicated to the proposition that truth matters more than convenience, that beauty is evidence of something real, and that the past holds secrets worth recovering. The lost empire of Tartaria vanished without a trace, or so we have been told. But traces remain everywhere for those with eyes to see. The investigation continues. The resonance persists. And the story is far from over.